Hello, everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today, we have an honor and pleasure to speak with a well-known human rights lawyer, Reed Brody. As you are aware, according to the investigation by the British Broadcasting Corporation, published on December 1st of this year, the ruling party of Georgia, Georgian Dream, might have used chemical weapons in order to quell the dissent in fall of last year, November, December of 2024. In relation to that action, there are many individuals, including victims and including myself, who are demanding accountability of people who took that decision and are reaching out to our international partners and international institutions to do so. In this regard, we asked for his opinions, advice, and to share his experience. Mr. Reed Brody is a well-known human rights lawyer, and he specializes in helping victims seek justice against perpetrators and dictators across the world. He has served as counsel for the victims in the case of Hissène Habré, a former dictator of Chad, whose issue of accountability was raised, and the victims of whose case did receive justice in front of the courts of Senegal. At the same time, Reed has extensive experience in working on a case against the dictator from Chile, Augusto Pinochet, as well as Jean-Claude baby dog Duvalier. He currently is working with the victims of former dictator of Gambia, Yahya Jammeh. At the same time, he's very well known among international lawyers' circles, and I cannot recommend enough his newly published book, To Catch a Dictator, The Pursuit and Trial of Hissène Habré, published in 2022, that shares the gemstones from his experience in bringing dictators to justice across the world. So I'm really happy that he will be sharing his advice and experience that we will later on apply or at least think about in relation to Georgia case. So great to have you with us, and thank you for your time.
Of course.
Thank you. It is a pleasure, and I'm sure a lot of people are expecting to hear from you about your experience. Uh, the audience knows already who you are, your background,
Okay.
with many countries, dictators of various kinds. And I would like to start asking about your experience as a human rights defender. What was the toughest in all these cases of you trying to bring accountability and justice to Hissène Habré or Pinochet or all the villains that you have in your that you have encountered in your biography? What was the toughest in this process, if you could outline
Sure.
one?
Well, I think the toughest is always developing the political will. In most of these cases, whether they be torturers or dictators or war criminals, um, the facts tend to be clear. Not always, but and what's really difficult is generating the political will to break through, the barriers of impunity. Very often, as you know, these cases take 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years in order to create that political will. I mean, we live in a world of impunity. We see that in Ukraine, we see that in Gaza, we see that in Sudan, we see it with the killing of Jamal Khashoggi from Saudi Arabia. And so, the real challenge is to convince the powers that be, whether it be a national court or an international court, to take those steps that are needed to bring, the perpetrators to justice.
Thank you. And a follow-up question. In that process, you had to be pragmatic, probably, right? Because you had to work with government, with judges, with courts, with prosecutors. How did you mix idealism that you have to have for your work and pragmatism for the advocacy that you were doing?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, you can't, I work with victims. In each of the cases, whether it be the case of Pinochet in Chile, Hissène Habré in Chad, Duvalier in Haiti, victims of U.S. counterterrorism operations, whatever it is, you work with victims. Um, but obviously, you can't, in most political systems, you can't um, you can't bring the perpetrators to justice by yourselves. You need some state or some international body. And, I don't know that there's one formula. I would say certainly one of the most important things is to put the victims front and center. You know, to make individual stories, to talk about the survivors, to talk about the victims, to talk about the families, um, and to give them, to give them names, to give them stories. I remember when we were working on the case of Augusto Pinochet, when he was, in London, when he was under house arrest. Um, One of the people on our legal team was a lawyer from Chile, Roberto Garraton. And Roberto had, 40 years earlier, or 25 years earlier, he had been the legal director of the Catholic Church's Human Rights Office in Chile. So it was the only one, because of the protection of the Catholic Church, who was actually able to document the crimes. And as history would have it, by the time that 25 years later that Pinochet was arrested, um, Roberto was the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Zaire, in what became the Democratic Republic of Congo. And he said, Reed, in Chile, I can tell you, because we filed cases, um, I can tell you exactly how many people were killed and how many people were disappeared. And I have all their names and we know all of their stories. I am the rapporteur on Zaire, and I can't tell you if there was 1 million people killed or 2 million people killed and when that reinforced to me the importance. And I think you all know I mean, Chile was a very, a landmark case in history where, Pinochet, put people in a national stadium. He killed them. But also you had people in Chile and Argentina, who year after year marched with posters, with banners, and you knew the names of the people. Um, I think the phrase was attributed, to Stalin that one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And when you're able to, so I think one of the lessons, one of the many lessons of all of these cases, um, is to focus on a story, to focus on a person, on people, on families who are fighting for justice. In the case of Hissène Habré, former dictator of Chad, who was brought to justice many years later in Senegal. There was a man, a modest civil servant named Suleiman Gengeng, who spent years in Hissène Habré's jails. And he took an oath before God that if he ever came out, he would fight for justice. And his story became kind of the story of the case. And he became very well known throughout Africa, throughout, the countries that we were trying to get involved. And I think you see that in most successful campaigns for justice, you can identify the victim, the family, the person who's fighting. People can identify with them. It's much easier, to convince a policymaker. I mean, it's one thing for a lawyer from New York or from London or from to go and say, "Oh, we have to do this. We have to do this." It's another thing when you're sitting there and you're with the victim who looks you in the eye, who looks the policymaker in the eye and says, "This is my story. I believed." I took this oath before God, this kind of, so that's, I mean, certainly one of the main lessons I take is to put the victims in the center. Obviously, there are many others. I think, you need to build alliances. You need to, depending on, if you're fighting to get somebody to justice in your own country or in another country, you need to make alliances. And you need to raise the cost, essentially, of inaction. You need to make it more difficult for policymakers not to act than to act.
Thank you. And a follow-up question. Because these issues, requesting and getting accountability on such questions, crimes against humanity, grave crimes that engage whole state machinery, accountability usually takes time. And as you mentioned, a decade, 15 years, 20 in case of Pinochet, also many years. How do victims approach this question from the perspective of emotions? Do they lose hope? Do they remain hopeful? Is it different from a case to a case? Do they have to have small victories from time to time?
Thank you. That last thing is exactly what you need to do, small victories. Obviously, every person is different. Every person reacts, differently to tragedy, particularly injustice. And in my work in human rights, you find people who have suffered immense tragedies and who just give up and who put their head down and just and then you have people who harness and transform their sufferings into a quest for justice. But you need, in whether it's, you need to keep a lot of people involved over 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. And one of the ways that you do it, yes, I mean, I grew up we had this Bible for activists in the U.S. in the 1960s called Rules for Radicals by a man named Saul Alinsky. And one of the rules was, win. You have to win sometimes.
Mhm.
Even, as you're on your way to the longer goal, you have to show people that, you are winning. You're getting some things. You're getting a decision from a court, a ruling from an international institution, compensation. You also need, I think, to give people, in many ways, a friend of mine has the saying that the quest for justice is justice. And that by involving people as agents in their own lives, and giving them a platform to talk about what happened to them, you are giving their life a certain kind of a meaning. And so, you can't just sit there and say, "Okay, guys, I'll come back in 10 years. I'll come back." No, people have to be brought along.
See you in
And
10.
yeah, and you have to make them feel that it's worth it.
Mhm.
That, they are putting out that, on the way to the final goal, there are smaller goals that are being reached. And that's, it depends on the situation.
Yes, and I hope many people who listen will read your book, To Catch a Dictator. I have a link put up, which has in detail your story of getting accountability for Hissène Habré. But one particular aspect I would like you to explain, perhaps it's in the book, how did it become possible to do so in a different jurisdiction where he had received safe haven, it seems? How did it happen that, so for the audience, as I understand, he fled to Senegal and years later, his question of accountability was held up in Senegal specifically, right? And also
Right.
compensations have been dispersed for victims, which is very rare and fantastic. Is that political circumstances? Is it change of will, or could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So, the Hissène Habré case really came out of the case we were talking about before, the case of Augusto Pinochet. In 1998, in October 1998, and 1998 was a big year for international justice because in July of 1998, in Rome, the countries of the world agreed to set up the International Criminal Court. 3 months later, in October, the former dictator of Chile, Augusto Pinochet, was in London, and he was arrested on a warrant from a judge in Spain, Baltasar Garzón, for alleged crimes committed in Chile 25 years earlier. And Pinochet went to court in England, in the UK, and said, wait, you can't arrest me. I'm a former head of state. I have immunity. And the case worked its way up to the House of Lords, which was then the High Court, the Supreme Court for England and Wales. And the court said, no, under the principle of universal jurisdiction, some crimes, attach liability anywhere in the world. And countries have an obligation, or countries have a right, and in some cases an obligation to prosecute those crimes, no matter despite your status as a former head of state. And so that really opened up, this was a case that had been brought, Chilean exiles, Chilean victims who were shut out of the courts in Chile. They filed the case in Spain under the principle of universal jurisdiction. The arrest warrant went to London. Pinochet was arrested. And when the House of Lords said, yes, you can do this, we realized that we had in this principle of universal jurisdiction, an instrument to bring to justice people who seemed out of the reach of justice by filing cases against them in other countries. And at the time, I was working at Human Rights Watch, and this was a moment of real effervescence. It's like, who's next? Okay, we got this guy, and I had this map on my wall, and people from Human Rights Watch,
like in the shows, in the movies.
Yeah, and people from Human Rights Watch, they came and they tacked up, okay, here's this guy is in this country, and this guy's in this country. Idi Amin was in Saudi Arabia, Mengistu was in Zimbabwe, the Haitian dictators were in Panama, he's in here. And what was interesting, and Hissène Habré, the former dictator of Chad, was in Senegal, another African country. And we were very excited, I should say, about the possibility that it would be a non-European country, that it wouldn't be just always England and Spain, but a country like Senegal, which had ratified all of the treaties, which was a country that considered itself to be very avant-garde in human rights, could exercise this jurisdiction. And so it was I described the Pinochet decision. I mean, it came out of the House of Lords that day with the decision, and I said, this is a wake-up call for dictators. But it wasn't so much a wake-up call for dictators. It was a wake-up call for activists and for victims. And so people all around the world looked and said, hey, maybe we can do that.
Right.
And so I was approached at the time by an activist from Chad, from Hissène Habré's country, who said, you know, we have a guy who's killed more people than Pinochet, and now he's in Senegal. Maybe we can file a case in Senegal. And so Human Rights Watch was very excited, and we began that process. We brought the victims from Chad to Senegal. We filed a case. You know, different countries have different laws as well, and in some cases, victims can file. You know, in the civil, I don't know too, you know, in the civil law system, victims can go directly to court. In a
Mm-hmm.
common law system, it's only the state or the prosecutor that can bring a case in court. But in most civil law systems, victims can file case directly. So the victims from Chad came and they filed cases in Senegal's courts against Hissène Habré. And, you know, I won't say it was easy. It took us 15 years to get to a trial. Um, but, you know, that's how we were able to do that. And you see now that, you know, the principle of universal jurisdiction is very, you know, anchored now in the laws of most, certainly in most European countries, as well as in many countries around the world. Each law is different. The crimes that attract universal jurisdiction in differ from country to country. The ability of victims to enter courts themselves, you know, in some countries, in many countries, unfortunately now, you need the prosecutor or the state,
Right.
you know, because they don't want, you know, a Western European country where they don't like this idea of people from all over the world coming and filing cases in their courts because it creates diplomatic headaches.
Mm-hmm.
So different countries have different laws, but basically that's the principle of universal criminal jurisdiction, that some crimes, and there are treaties, for instance. So, you know, the International Convention Against Torture, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
which has been ratified by, I don't know, over 130 countries, requires that a state in whose territory someone alleged to have committed torture is found must, if it does not extradite the person back to that country, um, uh, refer the case to its own prosecutorial authorities for the purpose of prosecuting. The same thing for war crimes. The Geneva Conventions require that if a war criminal comes into your country, no matter where the war crime was committed, the Geneva Conventions require that the country prosecute or extradite. Customary international principle, general principle. If somebody is accused of genocide, if somebody is accused of crimes against humanity, the same principles apply.
So I have a follow-up question. You mentioned that it was, yeah, it is a very special story when this one judge in Spain starts the whole process, right? A whole domino process. And that was some kind of a zeitgeist moment in international law. How necessary is that moment, this attitude, this belief, kind of global belief in justice? How necessary it is? Or could such cases be decided basically by a local judge who cares about international law without thinking about the universal values and consensus of Western states and so on and so forth?
Well, it really depends on the judge, on the system, on the independence of the judge. Um, you know, I mean, you could find, I mean, let's say, you know, let's say a Russian, general walked into a court in Paris or was visiting France. You know, you would have again the French rules. Each country has its own rules.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but you know, victims could go before a take the case to a judge. Here's it. Here's a picture of this guy walking around Bucha, you know, in Ukraine.
Giving
whatever,
orders. Yeah.
giving orders, and here it is, and here it is, and obviously the status quo is what's comfortable for everybody.
Yeah.
And it often requires an independent judiciary. That was, I mean, the judge who did this in Spain was very well known, became very well known, Baltasar Garzón, good friend now, a good friend of mine. You have judges who are more willing to take chances. Um, um, yeah, I should say that George Garzón was, did this for Chilean victims. He did it for other victims. When he tried actually in Spain to open up the mass graves from the Franco period,
Oh,
he was essentially forced out of the judiciary.
um,
So, you know, there are, judges, independent judges all over the world, often suffer reprisals and things. But again, it depends a lot on the legal system, whether a judge has that power, um, whether, as I said, many countries have restricted these international jurisdiction cases, um, so that the government has some kind of a filter. The Minister of Justice or the state prosecutor has to approve a case. Um, but in principle, certainly if somebody from Georgia or Russia or Israel, who is involved in crimes. Also, there are some countries that allow you to file these cases even if the alleged perpetrator is not yet in your country.
um,
Um, so, of course, what we found is that when one country has laws that are much better, all the victims go to that
okay.
country, and then
Yeah.
the law has to be modified. But it really depends. I mean, there are groups that have actually mapped out the laws of each country. I mean, there are various even software that allows you to see which country you can do what.
Mhm.
Um, but certainly it requires an independent or a strong judiciary.
Yeah. If a question about working with victims, I think some people who are listening, have been working with victims, have worked with various NGOs. Often the impression is that these human rights defenders, they have to be fluent in English and they have to know the ins and outs of UN, Geneva, London. What are the core principles or skills necessary for working with victims? Do you, I think maybe giving them too much hope is wrong, but you have to be optimistic. What are the skills when you work with people who come from very, very difficult backgrounds?
Humanity, I would say, is
Just humanity.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
obviously somebody along the way needs to know how these things work.
Mm,
Somebody has to have the legal skills, um, maybe the linguistic skills, depending on what countries are involved. I mean, I was able to work on the Pinochet case because I spoke, well, actually, the Pinochet case was mostly in England, but I was able to, I speak Spanish and French, but I don't speak German. I couldn't file a case. I couldn't file a case in Germany. Um, so I mean, I think, um, you know, one of the things I described, particularly in this book about our 20-year struggle to bring Hissène Habré to justice, was how somebody like me from a big Western international
okay.
NGO with millions of dollars, partners with impoverished Chadians, who were not activists. They were thrown in jail. They became activists. And developing a partnership between direct victims, even within Chad, you had the direct victims, and then you had the lawyers. So you're already talking about two separate strata of society. Um, and then you have the international people like me. And these are complex interactions in which you need I mean, when a case it took us 15 years to get to trial. And in those 15 years, we figured out how to do it.
Yeah.
It wasn't evident in the very beginning. Obviously, in a situation where you have, people who were just became victims because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, who don't have a background in law or in advocacy. But yet these are the people who you have to build up. I mean, we actually in the Hissène Habré case, we sent people to school. We trained people. We had seminars from victim to activist, so people understood, so they could act, so they could be their own advocates.
Yes. And maybe one question before last. After 15 years, did the victory still mean a lot to people, and to what kind of people? Because so I have personally experienced when a European Court of Human Rights decision comes 10 years after, it's still important. When I've
Yeah.
been a lawyer in that case, still you feel a vindication for how you have been wronged, right? Would you say it still meant, and what did it mean for people who have fought for so long, who have suffered and then devoted their time and energy to this case?
Sure. I mean, well, again, everyone has their own circumstances, and it must be said that in the 15 years, people died.
Yeah.
So, people who survived jail died, and it was then their children or their relatives. You also had people who began the struggle because their people died in jail. So they were fighting for their husband or for their father, and they died. So, obviously we have this saying that justice delayed is justice denied. And certainly you would want justice to be more rapid. But it's very sweet for people when it comes. Uh, you know, there are many, I mean, justice takes many forms. Of course, it also takes the form of compensation. As you mentioned in the Hissène Habré case, we were able to get, ultimately, it took us another 8 or 9 years, actually. It took us another 7 years to get $15 million, which was a very small amount given the number of victims. Um, you get people to be recognized, um, and you get people who can testify. I mean, for many people, especially actually one of the amazing things in the Hissène Habré trial were survivors of rape who testified. And for many of them, it was just the act of testifying while Hissène Habré was there
Yeah. Powerful. Very
that was
powerful.
very powerful.
Yeah.
Um, so, justice comes in many forms. But certainly, even 15 years later, it was very sweet for most people.
Yeah. I remember one victim who was sitting in a trial in Georgia, and she was saying, I just need to speak. That's it. I just
Yeah,
need to be able to sit here and say this. So that's very
yeah,
powerful, this act.
yeah.
And one final question also that is bothering me and a lot of activists is question of it's very fashionable now, well-being, self-care for human rights defenders. It's a very serious issue, right? People who are
Sure.
in the street talking to victims, talking to traumatized people, all bad and hearing bad news all the time, reading these reports which contain negative information. Would you say, do you have advice on this front? How you maybe writing a book was therapeutic also for you? Perhaps it was.
I think that you need to be somewhat obsessed in order to have, I think most successful campaigns, not whether for justice or for whatever, for require personal sacrifice and obsession. Whether it's to get a treaty, whether it's to political campaign, whether it's a fight for justice. And so you do throw yourself into things. Obviously, when you're dealing with people who have themselves been traumatized, I mean, I've kind of been doing this now for 40 years.
For a long time, yeah.
And maybe I have a thicker skin than and for me, sometimes the problem is almost the opposite. Like I have to feel. I can't take everything clinically. When I first started 40 years ago, when I was investigating in Central America and Nicaragua, and I would meet, talk to people. I mean, I would lose it. I was very difficult for me. And I feel like in many ways I've gone the other way. I mean, I've become a little too clinical and I need to stop. I have to say, the only time I'm not is when I'm dealing with children. I mean, I find it very difficult to deal with. I mean, I've met, in Sierra Leone, children who's had their arms cut off by the rebels and things like that. And that really, so now big human rights groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, they have all these self-care programs
Okay.
and things. But most of us, we just have to make do with our own
We
personalities
are
and
like
skills.
doctors, like doctors.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Reed, thank you very much for your time.
You're
Much
quite
appreciated.
welcome, Anna. Good luck.
Thank you. That's very
Been a
useful and good
pleasure.
luck with your work. Much respect for what you have done and you are doing.
Thank you, and hi to all my friends in Georgia.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.